So first I'd like to introduce you our first two speakers, starting with Heather Brown, who was trained initially as an elementary school teacher, but she is now an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta. Dr. Brown is also an autistic researcher passionate about supporting the academic achievement and overall well-being of autistic children, youth, and adults. Her community-based participatory research aims to empower autistic individuals to be more self-confident in their neurodiversity and better understand the factors that most support their well-being at home, work, and school. Next, we have Dr. Thompson-Hodgetts. I'm sorry, I just have to find it. Sorry.
I know I can introduce myself if you'd like.
Oh, I'm not finding it. It's here, here. There you go. She was an associate professor and acting chair at the Department of Occupational Therapy, Faculty of Rehabilitation at the University of Alberta. Her work is focused on contextual approaches to support inclusion, participation, and belonging for autistic people. Thank you both for being here today. You guys came probably from one of the longest ways, so we are happy to have you, and enjoy the session, you guys.
Great. Okay, so welcome. So I think it's maybe fun context to know that there was the precursor to this program that was just called ART, didn't have the CAN. And I was in the second cohort of that program, which I either started in 2005 or 2006. And Heather was shortly after, just a couple of years after.
2009.
Yeah, so we were sitting in these seats in this hotel, which had a different name at the time. And the rooms have been renovated. But so we were out there. So I just think it's super, super cool that it's back. For this session, we have about an hour. So if you need to stand or fidget, or if anything is like, if you're uncomfortable with anything and you need to go out, then we can be absolutely flexible with that.
And some of my talk is I'm talking a little bit about mental health and talking a little bit about mental health concerns. So if at any point you feel unsafe or you feel like you need a break, it's completely and totally okay to stand up and walk out the room. We won't be offended, we won't be disappointed, and please just take care of yourself in any way you need.
Yeah. And we also know there's tons of diversity in your life experience and the type of research you do, where you are in your training program. And so for some of you, this will be a shift. And for some of you, you'll think, okay, this is sort of how I live and work related to autism. We do a version of this talk for educators, all across Alberta and soon going into BC as well. And so for them, this concept is very new. So we'll shift things a little bit for you. We'll include a little bit more research, but that was sort of the impetus for this type of talk was educators they asked for it. So basically, we're just going to talk about framing or reframing for some of you, how we talk about how we see autism and other forms of neurodivergence. We'll talk about things like emotional regulation, things about isolation and belonging. And then we'll integrate some of our lived experience and some of our research into that. And I say our research because I think we do 95% of our research together.
At this point?
At this point. And so we just want to start a little bit with some terminology. I think we're all really aware that language, I think as a society and as a world, we're becoming increasingly aware of the importance of language. And so a little bit of background about language in the world of autism. So neurodiverse refers to like the infinite variation of humanity. So it's actually bigger than people, but we'll stick with people for today. So if we talked about neurodiverse learners, that is all students, all trainees, everyone.
Because if you took every trait, every strength, every ability, if you took all of those, there's no person who's average on every single one. No one. So neurodiverse, everyone's brain is different in some way from every other.
Yeah. Yep. And then neurodivergent are those that differ from the majority of society. It's not uncommon though, right? So it's the majority, but it's very common. And so that's autism, but broader than autism. All forms of neurodivergence. So neurotypical is someone who's like the majority of society, like Heather just said, but huge variability. And then we threw holistic in here because people often use the term neurodivergent as synonymous with autistic, but it's not. So autistic is a proportion of neurodivergent, and that sometimes you'll hear the word holistic to
refer to
to
non-autistic.
refer. Yeah.
To non-autistic.
And then this is more for teachers, but we do also give some prompts. For example, don't use terms like suffers from autism. That's incredibly pathologizing. When it comes to identity, first person, first other language, as I'm sure you know, there's different preferences, so ask, right? That's kind of the take-home message there. And then there's also terms around sort of on the autism spectrum that I was told as a non-autistic person was kind of the safe place to go. Again, I just ask what people prefer. And then there's also some dialogue now about spectrum versus constellation, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So if you're new to this, all sorts of terminology and lots of really cool dialogue going on. Okay, go Heather.
Go Heather. So I apologize to those of you who've heard this before, but I'm going to start by talking a little bit. I'm going to tell you a story about myself, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about why some of this reframing matters so much. So imagine it's the late 1970s, and there's a village in rural Ontario that is so small that there's no traffic light. Now, all the women in this village have gathered at a small church just a short walk from home for a special brownie potluck dinner. Now, imagine a little girl in a brownie's uniform who is staring at a long line of potluck items spread before her, but she chooses nothing. Because this little girl is unable to eat almost any of the foods she is offered. She eats only Cheerios with milk for breakfast, toast and peanut butter for lunch, and macaroni and cheese for supper. And she eats it every single day. Now imagine that the caring adults around her notice the little brownie is eating nothing. So they say to her, "Don't you want to eat?" But this little girl, who can't be more than 5, has learned one lesson very well. There is something very wrong with her because she doesn't like to eat. She has seen and heard and endured endless battles to eat, endless trips to doctors and specialists, endless conversations about what is wrong with her. Why won't she eat? So when the likely well-meaning mother asks this little girl why the brownie isn't eating, the brownie instantly experiences intense shame. And that causes a spectacular meltdown. Because this little girl struggles to regulate even the simplest of emotions, and shame is well beyond her ability to cope. So my biggest obstacle to living well is not my autism. It is my extremely fragile mental health. And my experience is not unique. Cribb and colleagues in 2019 interviewed autistic adults and their families about the extent to which they felt being autistic affected their current and future lives. All agreed that co-occurring mental health conditions were the biggest obstacles to their futures, with severe cases of anxiety and depression being reported. Similarly, Swedish researchers examined the medical records of over 50,000 autistics and found that we are 7 to 9 times more likely to engage in suicidal behaviors compared to non-autistic people. That is why Jim Sinclair wrote in 2002, "There is a tragedy that comes with autism, not because of what we are, but because of the things that happen to us." So in their book, Sensory Motor Psychotherapy, Interventions for Trauma and Attachment, Doctors Pat Ogden and Janine Fisher define trauma as any experience that is stressful enough to leave us feeling helpless, frightened, overwhelmed, or profoundly unsafe. Like many autistic people, I am primarily hypersensitive to sensory input, which means that I experience many sensations as irritating, overwhelming, and stressful. Because my body seems to view so many sensory inputs as unpleasant and threatening, it goes into fight or flight with alarming regularity. The wonderfully horrible result, however, is that the stress that I'm experiencing due to sensation makes my nervous system even more sensitive to incoming stressors. That means that my nervous system is often in a state of hyperarousal and hypervigilance before anything else in my day even happens. The crucial point is that a lot of the behaviors that are targeted for treatment in autistic children would be considered normal reactions to extreme stress if our extreme stressors were more easy for doctors, parents, teachers, and everyone else to understand. So on this slide, what you can see is that there's this overabundance of autistic-specific stressors in any given environment. So you have social confusion and bullying. You've got social isolation and peer rejection. You've got limited opportunities for engagement. You've got prevention or punishment from your preferred behaviors. And then you've got all of these sensory reactions. So these ongoing stresses and trauma over time actually change your brain chemistry. So it's more frequently prone to anxiety and depression. So sorry, I sort of messed up my slide a bit, but just forgive me. Anyway, these things here, they're engendering this traumatic conditioning in autistic youth. So basically, one of the very physiological consequences of early life adversity is that it actually alters allostasis, which is your body's ability to maintain stability through changes wrought by challenging environments. So because I have reduced allostasis, it means that I'm less likely to be able to maintain my calm, cool, and collected when I'm faced with various challenges. And basically, this sort of prolonged overactivation leads to this sort of chronic stress response. And it's something called that basically many autistic people are experiencing what is known as toxic chronic stress on a daily basis. But to better really understand how this toxic chronic stress or how come we end up in these sort of states, we really need to understand what are two key pillars to emotional well-being. And one of them is having a positive identity, and the second one is finding belonging and connection. And so in this next section, I'm going to sort of explain how these two concepts are related to this sort of overactivation of this chronic stress response. So when I reflect on my own experience, I realize that from a very young age, I had internalized that I was bad, that I was overly sensitive and overly emotional, that my needs were unreasonable, that I wasn't likable, that I wasn't normal, and that, as my mother unfortunately loved to say, I had to change. So these beliefs, coupled with the environmental stressors, led to anxiety, panic attacks, shame, depression, meltdowns, and further trauma. In fact, my anxiety disorder became necessary for my survival because I have to become hyper-aware almost 100% of the time in order to successfully hide and suppress my natural autistic tendencies. Wherever I am, whether I'm at home, with my family, or at school, at work, I was basically required to mask my weird, and attempt to pass as normal or not autistic. I was really good at it too. But I believe the problem is that autistic people are taught that we are broken and that who we are naturally is not okay. The medical model, or the pathology paradigm, has created stories of autism in which the parents of autistic children and autistic people themselves are told that we're inherently inferior to non-autistic people, that autistics lack something fundamental to being human, and that autism is something to be fixed, cured, controlled, or avoided at any cost. And it's this type of thinking that has led families to believe that it's better to make their children drink bleach than it is to allow them to be autistic. And this is not something that people were doing in the 80s. This is something that CNN needs to put on their freaking website in 2019, that drinking bleach is a particularly bad way to support your children. Being told that there's something wrong with you is inherently disempowering. For people in positions of power and trust, to imply that being neurodivergent means to be fundamentally flawed as a person and then to behave accordingly is a particularly bad way to teach youth that they have value and worth. For we have long known that one of the central features of depression is a negative or undesirable feeling of difference or deviance from others. I want to change. That's like me. So, when disability is perceived as a weakness and not just a different form of normal, it often hinders social participation. So participation refers to how an individual's life is interwoven with the social life of their family, their friends, their community, and society. And it includes feelings of belonging and engagement. So as we already said, as autistic children develop, they're often isolated and victimized, both by their peers and adults, which has devastating effects on their mental health. But the medical profession's response to this fact has been to categorize the deficits, which have categorized autistic deficits by naming them and listing them in the DSM, which has legitimized the development of a host of interventions and evidence-based practices for remediating the perceived social deficits of autistic children. Social skills, so I think there's a slide missing here, and so I'm sort of struggling to figure out what is the missing link here, so forgive me, that's why I'm sort of pausing here. But if I go back one slide, so we're talking about social participation and about how we've sort of categorized these deficits and that we've got all of these programs to sort of remediate us. And one of the ways that we often are told is that we have these sort of deficit-based social skills, right? And so often autistic children, one of the most common things that we're thrown into is social skills classes to learn how to quote-unquote behave properly. But these social skills classes are often really disliked by autistic people, and they actually can diminish authenticity by encouraging autistic people to camouflage their true feelings, beliefs, and behaviors to better align with neurotypical norms. So while we all use these camouflaging or masking or impression management strategies at times to be able to present a best version of ourselves or to blend in society, but for autistic people, we often have to present the socially acceptable version of ourselves and by suppressing or hiding our natural autistic traits and behaviors, or even our natural responses. So in a lot of our research, when we're asking autistic people about about their camouflaging and masking, or about being at school, their experiences at school, a lot of what you hear is about how they're desperately trying to hide their emotional overreaction because they feel like it's not allowed. So in other words, I'm really bothered by this light and it's making me want to freak out, but my goal here right now is to pretend that it's not making me freak out and to just get through it. And that's really, really hard to do. Right? Like, what I'm trying to say is that while, yeah, that light isn't a big deal, I understand that logically, my nervous system says it's a very big deal, right? My nervous system lights up pain signals in my brain as if you are hurting me. That's what we see when we put our brains in neuroscience. Or if I'm freaking out at school because the kids are bullying me, yeah, maybe it doesn't seem like a big deal to you, but the way that my reaction, the way that my body is reacting, it is a very legitimate response to what's going on. And that's what, but we know that that's not acceptable. We know we're not supposed to feel that way, and so we're constantly just trying to hide the fact that we're so upset, right? And that's so hard on us. It really is. The other thing often, though, is that if we're not just hiding our upset, if we're hiding our flapping, or we're hiding that we're doing things differently, it's often because we have this sort of what we call internalized ableism. In other words, we've internalized the belief that this is an unacceptable way to behave. And so often, like, for example, an autistic person wrote, "It's embarrassing to see how people stare at us, and you know that they're commenting." So all of this sort of camouflaging, masking, it can have some negative consequences. There are positives. I want to make that very clear. There are positives to learning how to do this, but there are a lot of negatives. And a lot of these negatives are around how you feel. So in the moment, you feel inauthentic, you feel anxious, you feel shame. But over time, you might feel really confused about, like, who am I? Am I this person or that person? It can lead to burnout. It can lead to depression. It can lead to suicidality. We don't have causal patterns here. We don't have good longitudinal data to say simply engaging in camouflaging is going to lead to all these things. So I don't want to say that it's directly causal, but it's certainly adding load. It's adding load that you are carrying every single day. It's adding stress to every single day that many people are not experiencing in the same way, if that makes any sense. So I am now going to pass off to my illustrious co-presenter.
Well, no
Just
pressure.
because that was like the happy part, right? Anyway, she'll do much better, I promise.
But I will say, so we talk a lot about camouflaging, and I don't know your areas of research. I'm looking forward to learning about them later. And when we talk about, we all do impression management, right? You're all sitting here very professionally. No one's wearing sweats. Feel free to wear sweats, but no one's wearing sweats. But it's a difference between learning that you have to present differently because you're wrong, to learning that there is polite sort of behavior. So how many people are familiar with the double empathy problem? Okay, quite a few. So we wanted to introduce this to further illustrate neurodiversity as universal. This was not around when I was a trainee, or if it was, I didn't hear about it. So at that time, the theories were things like the executive functioning deficit, the weak central coherence, those types of deficit focused.
No theory of mind.
Theory of mind, yes, how could I forget that? And those are still around, but this really resonates with us because it talks about different types of brains. It talks about differences, and it really reinforces that the social fractures aren't all the fault of autistic people. So proponents of this theory believe that the communication breakdown between autistic, non-autistic people is a two-way issue. So it's caused by both parties' difficulties in understanding each other. Okay. So I think that this quote says it quite well. So if it takes this much effort to assist someone with autism in interacting with neurotypicals, then where does the assumption that a neurotypical can understand and interact with someone with autism so easily come from? So that is a quote from an autistic participant in a social skills training intervention. And there's been a number of studies in this area. So we'll explore one empirical study supporting this theory in case it is new to you. So most of the studies use what's called a diffusion chain technique. So the previous slide showed the telephone game. So that's one example of what we did. There's also some where all autistic participants, all non-autistic participants, and then the diffusion chain of autistic, non-autistic participants will complete a task. So telephone game, there's some where they're building towers and others. And what these studies tend to find, just like the theory proposes, is it's not a problem with autistic people. It's not a problem with non-autistic people. The breakdown is in the mix. And so you can see here that the red line is non-autistic, the green line is autistic, kind of equal performance. And then you can see that the mixed chains have lower performance. This really reinforces that it's not a problem with autistic people. And that also suggests that it's incumbent on non-autistic people as well to put into effort to making things work. So it's not about social skills training. So autistic people can sort of communicate as non-autistic people. It is really a responsibility of everyone. And then this is just another study, and feel free to jump in if you want, where they had non-autistic people watch videos of autistic people in authentic social situations. And what they found was that people reported that they wouldn't want to hang out with them based on the video. And then when they took the video away and just had the transcripts of the identical interactions, there was no difference. And so what that tells us is It's something about the style or how people are presenting and nothing to do with the actual social communication per se.
It's the
Do you want to add to
style.
that?
Yeah, it's just the style. It's how I'm presenting the information rather than the information that I'm actually saying.
Yeah.
Do you want me to take that?
Yeah.
Okay. So what can we do given all this? Like given the fact, like what would be the next step forward? And so how can we best sort of prevent the stigma, the discrimination, and the trauma that's so often perpetrated against neurodivergent youth? Well, to actually do this, it really requires a multifaceted approach. And one of the best ways that we can do that is we can start by telling a different story of what it means to be neurodivergent. And so obviously the best, or the ones that we like the most, is this idea of biodiversity, which is where this quote came from. So basically each individual brain is more like a unique rainforest, teeming with growth, decay, competition, diversity, and selection. But we also really like this idea of the metaphor of the trees, right? Like, so like there's this amazing story that you can find online where he's talking about how the tree metaphor works, and he's got this whole like long story, and I love it, but it takes too long, so I can't actually use it in my presentations. But essentially what he's trying to say is that, you know, if we're looking at oak trees, yeah, an oak tree is supposed to be really tall and it looks a certain way and it's majestic, but is the oak tree and then the little bushes beside it, like, yeah, they're different, but they're still equally valuable, right? And if the big oak tree's there and it's taking all the light, yeah, the bushes can't really grow and they look all shaggy and whatever, but you give them the right environment and suddenly these bushes are just fine, and there's nothing wrong with being a bush versus an oak tree. That's the idea. I know I'm ridiculous, but just go with it. So I like to go with a more balanced or more strength-based sort of story of autism, and I sort of put this sort of this definition together based on this work of Dr. T.C. Weissman, who basically is a Canadian autistic person who now has her PhD, and she's in BC, but also with this other, I think he's autistic, Dr. Scott Robinson. But basically, they sort of came up with this idea that autistic people are viewed under the neurodiversity model as individuals who possess a blend of cognitive differences across three main areas. So language, communication, and social interaction, sensory processing and motor skills, as well as executive functioning and self-regulation. And so we often refer to autism as what we call a constellation, because people can vary widely on these and other dimensions. And the actual strengths and differences, or strengths and challenges of any two autistic people were often quite different. But we also really need to understand this idea of it being a dynamic disability, right? So if you put me in an environment with enough stress, right? You put me in the worst environment that you can imagine, I'm not going to appear quite as quote unquote having low support needs as I do at this moment. Although, like, even now I don't really appear as low support needs, but you know what I mean, right? Like if you really stress me out, I may not be able to communicate. I may not be able to tell you what's going on. I might have a panic attack, but that doesn't mean that that's who I am every single day. It's a dynamic disability, and my environment shapes how well I am functioning. Okay, Madam.
Well, and I think that's a really important point, because as researchers often will now report support needs as a demographic characteristic, and that sometimes there is this impression of people with low support needs as not needing support. And so as a demographic variable, it makes sense. We have to report things in research, but just to be aware that it's just not so black and white. Okay, so what we thought we'd do is present some of the work that we've been doing in Alberta, although some of it does have collaborators across Canada and elsewhere, related to neurodiversity affirming approaches. Most of our work, well, a lot of our work's in schools, not all of it, just as an example of how we're trying to shift this. And I should probably preface this, that when I was an art trainee, my PhD work was on a remedial approach to get autistic students to sit in their seats and pay attention to the teacher at school. So I too am in a process of learning and unlearning my own perspective. I was trained medical model.
So was I. Didn't even know about neurodiversity until I came across.
Yeah. So I should preface that this is a learning process for us as well. So I really like this study by Goodall and colleagues, where they worked with 11 to 17-year-old autistic students. I believe this is from the UK. for whom they were all mainstream schools and found it challenging. And they wanted to know about their educational experience from their perspective. And just to summarize a in-depth qualitative study, briefly, they defined inclusion as belonging, being valued for who they are as a person by their teachers and others, while also being afforded the supports to thrive at school. So it didn't neglect the fact that we have support needs. And so, like their title says, inclusion is a feeling and not a place. So one of my grad students, who is almost done, drew a lot from this study. She's an OT in the school board in Calgary. And she has been working for 20-something years and had lots of her own perceptions of what she needed to do to support autistic students. And so she wanted to hear from them what their best school environment was. So she's working with grade 4 to 6 students in this study. And as an OT, she immediately thought, okay, it's about the sensory environment, it's about visual schedules, it's about transitioning to decreased sensory input. And so she did a whole variety of qualitative and arts-based activities they all ended up being grade 6 students. And essentially what she found, without using the word belonging, was that it was about belonging, even with these younger kids who communicated in a variety of ways. All of them had some spoken language that they used, but to different capacities. And so as you can see from this, we also did some like drawing activities, write, draw, tell. We did photo voice, photo elicitation, and all sorts of things. But essentially what it came down to was it was about belonging. And how do we belong? So they talked about alternative ways to belong. So for example, all the students, I think, talked about how recess, they didn't want to go out and socialize. They wanted to go to a quiet space to recuperate, to go back to the social environment of the classroom. And they felt that they belonged when they were allowed and facilitated to do that. They talked about kindness and understanding. They talked about feeling emotionally safe and valued. They talked about different ways of learning, and also about being physically safe. And the physical safety, a lot of that did relate to the sensory environment. Anything you want to add on that?
No,
Heather's on the committee too. And so when we talk about neurodiversity affirming practices, we still focus on goal attainment, and it does acknowledge that neurodivergence can be disabling. So we're not promoting toxic positivity. We're just recognizing that neurodivergence itself is not a flaw. It's not an illness. So we see diversity as strength. So differences in behavior, communication, needs, and preferences are equally valid to neurotypical people. We see that everyone has worth and value. Everyone has the right to self-determination and dignity and acceptance to be treated for who they are. When we talk about research methods as well, I just want to reinforce, it doesn't mean that other research foci, what's the word?
Foci.
What we do, and approaches aren't valid. If you claim, though, to use an affirming approach, it's actually incumbent on you as a researcher, autistic or not, to do that work, and not on the autistic participants who may be in your studies. So how do we do this? So we're going to blend in some research for you. When we talk with educators, we get like really practical. But we're going to talk about a number of overlapping ways to support autistic students or others to feel that they belong and that they're valued members of their communities. So Heather and I will kind of go back and forth based on our areas and research in these topics. How are we doing for time?
We're doing good. It was the year 3 had to move to their next one.
Okay.
So year 1 and 2 we still have, and when are we done, please? Could you remind us? 12, yeah. So we're good. It was just that year 3 had to go to the next session.
Okay, great.
Okay.
All right. Why don't you take the first couple?
Okay, no problem. I will. Okay, so we have basically 5, so just to, because we got interrupted, let me go back. So we have 5 neuroaffirming practices that we're going to describe, and I'm going to start with the first one. Okay, so the first one has to do with, the first one is taking these strength-based approaches. And so what does it actually mean to have a strength-based approach? So one of the most important things to think about is that actually autistic people, we desire to be seen as having positive attributes, strengths, and agency beyond merely our disability. And what you can see on the right here is a study that was done by Cope and Remington. They were looking at autistic adults in the workforce, and they were trying to find out from both the autistic people themselves as well as the employers, what are some of their most common strengths. And so you can see here that we have a number of common strengths, including superior memory, pattern recognition, attention to detail, as much as it drives all of my grad students insane, because I spend way too much time editing their papers. But regardless, like all of these things can be a strength in a context, right? Like I'm not saying that going to an extreme in terms of pattern and detail recognition can't also be a weakness. Like obviously some of these strengths that's one of my greatest challenges, right? It's always taking these strengths to an extreme, and I'm always trying to, rein them in. But regardless of that being my challenge, these are still strengths. These are still what makes me a successful professor today and can make many other autistic people successful in whatever field they hope to or want to be successful in. And we can't take away the fact that while these sometimes lead to great challenges as well, like some of these strengths do really drive both me and everyone around me insane. I apologize to all autistic people that I just said that. But regardless, even if that's true, they still lead to great strengths. They're still the same trait can lead to great things in this world. So a strength-based approach but even if I say all that, I want to be very clear. A strength-based approach is not about saying that everything is rosy. I'm never going to stand up here and tell you that my life is necessarily easy, okay? But it's also about, it's fine to identify, at least as far as I'm concerned, it's fine to identify areas that might be of concern, especially if the autistic person themselves is telling you that. Right? If an autistic person comes to you and they say, I want to succeed in the workplace that's dominated by neurotypicals, so please help me, there's absolutely nothing wrong with helping that person, right? But we also have to reduce the stigma that's associated with autism and other forms of neurodiversity by normalizing neurodivergent ways of being and affirming neurodivergent people as valued and diverse members of our community. So these strength-based education, and you can say that as strength-based clinical practice, like you can say education more broadly, like in the big picture, but these strength-based education begins with teachers or educators or clinicians discovering what these kids do best. And then we use their strengths while learning new or difficult things so that they can reach previously unattained levels of excellence. So if you think about it, I'm standing up here before you and I can freely admit I have a strong social anxiety disorder and I've had it for years. Why am I standing up here before you and doing this? It's not been easy, I'll tell you, it's been brutal. I've had to learn so many things and overcome so many challenges in order to be a professor, to be a successful professor. But that's what I wanted. I wanted to be a successful professor. I wanted to learn how to do these things. And so I used my other strengths and my other strategies to learn these skills. But if you had just told me as a 16-year-old girl that I must do this, well, that's going to feel like torture, right? Like you're actually getting me to go through all of these incredibly anxious experiences, and I'm willing to learn these things because it was valuable to me. And so that's what you're looking for with these kids. You want to figure out what is it that they want. And then if you can figure out what it is they want for themselves, then you can try and figure out, okay, well, if that's your goal, if that's what you want, then what are the skills that you need to learn along the way? Not because you're broken, not because you're too stupid to learn it, but because we all need to learn things. And if that's your goal, these are the steps, or these are the things that you need to do in order to reach that goal. And so that's what we're talking about. Do you want to add?
I do want to add.
Okay, go for it.
As you were saying that approach works for everybody. Right? That's a universal thing to draw on people's interests and strengths and motivations. The difference that I was a school-based therapist in home and community for years, is that the autistic kids and youth and adults are often basically told, oh, but that's not going to work for you. So just to preface that this is a good approach for everyone and needs to be used for everyone.
Good point.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. So, do you want to do the slide? Because it is yours. Or you want me to do it?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so basically let autistic students shine and as experts and leaders in the classroom, and especially in the areas of strength. So one of the things when you're looking at trying to reduce stigma or you're looking to try to promote belonging, what we really need to do is show the rest of the students in the class what is valuable about that person, right? Like show the kids what they can do, what their strengths are. Maybe it's art, maybe it's math, maybe it's whatever it is, but we need legitimate ways for these autistic people to shine in the classroom, just like we have other kids that shine in multiple ways. We've got major athletes, we've got major academics. We need to figure out the ways that these kids shine and then affirm those ways. When we're looking at how you sort of use strengths to guide intervention, what you're looking at is you're sort of looking at sort of three main steps. So like, what have I observed that's going to work really well for this autistic person? What tools, activities, or learning sequences are bringing the best out of this person or bringing the best out of the youth or adult? And then what can be done or what has been done to support that individual's learning and development where there is a challenge. But if you look at some of these models of well-being, and there are multiple, there's, Seligman's flourishing model, but this is one that was developed by Benson and Scales. And basically their model of well-being, they talk about this thing called a spark. And what they say, and this is a model of well-being for all people, I want to preface this is just like positive psychology stuff. So they talk about a spark is a passion for a self-identified interest, skill, or capacity that metaphorically lights a fire in a person's life, providing energy, joy, purpose, and direction. And so according to Benson and Scales, this is one of the key pillars of well-being. But yet, for autistic people, being intensely focused on a particular subject or activity is considered a defining feature of autism. And up to 95% of us have intense, people don't really like that term, or passionate, people like that one better, interests. And our time pursuing these sort of passionate interests can amount to that of a part-time job, right? My son hates school. He dropped out of school after not even one term of college. Like, ugh, my son has hated school since the moment he was born. Regardless, if you ask my son about tanks, he can tell you every single goddamn fact about every goddamn tank that's ever been created in the history of the world, and he spends hours playing this stupid tank game and the reason that in this tank game, I don't really understand it, but basically they've imported the engineering schematics of every tank ever created in history, and then you use these tanks to do something. And you ask him about tanks, he can tell you everything about it. That's what I mean, right? Like, okay, yeah, it's kind of annoying that's like if it's Minecraft, you don't really see the value in that. I understand that. But regardless, we can do this. So how can we focus these kids or these young adults so that they can use that strength in a way that actually supports their well-being long-term? So our passionate interests offer opportunities for learning and can be used to introduce these more novel skills and activities. But it's really critical to realize that one of the most common strategies for regulating us or getting us to behave is to basically punish us by removing access to this passionate interest. But to punish a neurodivergent or autistic person by removing or severely limiting our access to our passionate interests is in essence to strip us of a large source of comfort, soothing, and strength. It's an ableist approach based on an assumption of what is right or wrong or proper behavior. Rather, a much more neuroaffirming approach would be merge our passionate interest areas with what we're already doing or what we need to do at school or work. In fact, doing so may be the only way for us to show our best ability or our true levels of ability. And so there has been empirical research on this. This is not just rhetoric. So Dr. Wood went into a classroom and she was looking at the advantages for autistic kids of using these passionate interests. And what she found is that there was improved access to learning, curriculum, and tests. There was greater task completion. There was improved communication. There was more socialization, greater independence, more intrinsic enjoyment of an activity, a source of comfort, and expertise. And so I just told you my son hated school, hated every minute of it. He has a learning disability, he has autism, he has ADHD, he's got a learning disability in written expression. I could not, and as much as I'm an academic, this kid was not following in my footpath, right? Like that was never going to happen, and Heather had to accept it. Regardless, I did have one major win, and this is it. So one of his intense, passionate interests was Minecraft, and so he will never have put that much effort into his homework ever again. But for one day, what we did, basically the homework, it was a science thing, and you're looking at the you're basically comparing different metals. And so because Minecraft had all those different sort of metals and different concrete, we basically ran an experiment trying to show something about density and mass and something about the different materials. And he loved it because basically you're blowing up stuff. So you know what I mean? So he was willing to put in all this effort and time and cooperate for a child who never cooperated, because I was able, in this one instance, to merge special interest areas. What's even funnier is if we go back here and you look at increased communication. So one of my biggest challenges with my 20-year-old son now is that he refuses to communicate with me in any way. If I ask him about a day, it was fine. If I ask him about how he's doing, good. If I ask him if anything's new, no. If I ask him if he's playing games, of course. So this kid never talks, right? But I really, really hurt my foot, and I needed to go and do this big presentation in Ottawa, and so Aiden agreed to come with me as my support person, and it was amazing. And while I was there, he decided, to actually see a real human in real life, which he almost never does. And so he had this friend in Ottawa that he had never met, and he was actually really, because they only see each other online, and so he was actually really nervous about going. And at one point, he even said he wasn't going to meet him. Like, he wasn't going to go meet this friend because he didn't know what to do, and, you know, they couldn't play games together, so what would they even talk about? And it was, anyway, in the end, he went. And you know why? Because Ottawa has a tank museum. I'm not joking. And so not only did he finally go and agree to meet this friend, and they, of course, spent at the tank museum, he spent 4 hours with the friend at the tank museum. 4 hours. And then he comes back to me, and it's the end of my conference day, and so I'm like, go up to my room or whatever. He's there. 10 minutes. He talked to me for 10 minutes without stopping. This kid talked to me 10 minutes about his day without stopping and told me everything that there was about the Tank Museum, because that was something he actually wanted to talk about. You see what I mean? It makes such a huge difference to who we are. So Sandy, up to you.
Okay. And what time is it?
20 minutes.
Okay. I'm going to go quickly through some of the research stuff. So the other thing that we're doing a lot of is we're focusing on other people. So the peers, teachers, educators, as the impetus for change. And for us, change means mostly education, understanding, awareness. So changing their thoughts, behaviors. This is a study that we did a few years ago. Oh, I don't have the other authors. Melanie Couture was involved, for those of you that know Melanie. Oh, she got here? Awesome. Emily, you were involved in this, weren't you? Yeah.
She just did the interviews.
Yeah. So anyway, so what we did, we started with summer camps because some previous work on disclosure of a diagnosis. So we did a study where on parents disclosing their autistic child's diagnosis to people. And what they told us was community contexts are where they just grapple the most. We don't know if they're going into, Cubs or Scouts or whatever, or swimming lessons. Is it going to increase understanding and inclusion and acceptance, or is it going to increase exclusion? And so we went into a summer camp and we did basically a disclosure study. So participants, we had 2 groups. They had the choice of whether or not to disclose. And for those that chose to disclose, we did about a 5 to 10 minute intervention, and we did use the label autism. And then we talked about what that meant for that child. So for example, the purpose of unique behaviors that the camp counselors and peers might not understand. We talked about their skills, their favorite activities and interests. We wanted to reinforce similarities between peers. And then we gave some concrete strategies that peers could use to engage with that autistic child. So for example, one thing that comes to mind is one of the children got really, really close into kids' faces, and the peers, understandably, were very uncomfortable with that. When we explained that this child didn't use spoken language to communicate, and so that was their way of saying, I think you're really cool and I want to be near you. And so for the peers, we just said, just take their shoulders and say, cool, come to my side, let's go. Super simple. But for peers, it helped them understand. And when we think about this, I think all of us are probably uncomfortable with what we don't understand, no matter what it is. So that was the sort of motivation for it. It was a fairly small study. So for all of you that know about, the wonders of statistics and effect size, we had a huge effect size with a small sample, which tells us that, okay, there might be something meaningful here. So we had a big increase in peer engagement in the group that did the intervention, the disclosure group. And then we had a decrease in the group in which we didn't disclose, and that fit our hypothesis. We thought when kids understand, they'll engage more over the week of camp, and as they engage more, they realize how cool their peer is. Good. And when kids don't understand, they'll probably disengage more. That is what they found. We interviewed the kids and camp counselors at the end of camp, and they told us it was really changed behavioral attribution. Yes, we understand more. We no longer see this child as like weird or disruptive. And so they were more tolerant. And then they really liked the strategies. They said, okay, lets me see similarities. It gives me somewhere to start. I know how to engage with this child. They also really appreciated permission to ask questions. So even kids understand, okay, that I think maybe there's something unique about that child, but it's not acceptable to ask. And so it gave them permission to have conversations. Oh, he's making that noise today. What does that mean? Oh, that's a really positive noise. All this being said, we felt, this approach, feasible, seemed to have some positive outcomes. It didn't increase inclusion. These were 5-day camps. Well, yes, belonging. Yeah, essentially. So that was okay. But as we reflected on this work, the intervention that sort of outed and was defined around autism, while it had positive outcomes, it still seemed a bit othering. It just wasn't sitting as well with us as it did when we started the study. And so now we've moved into, Heather and I, into a study with a big school district in Edmonton, where we're doing a more universal approach. So the school came to us, the board came to us and said, we're really struggling with how to support autistic students, especially those with high support needs and those that have behaviors that other peers are really uncomfortable with, and teachers and aides sometimes. We saw your work on the summer camp study, so how can we use this sort of peer-focused approach in the school system? Because teachers and educational assistants have no time, right? I'm sure you know they're all just getting more and more on their plates. So we wanted to do it in a universal lens. So we're not outing any autistic students, if you will. However, the classrooms are being referred to us based on a student in the classroom. And so what we've done so far, and I say so far because we still have 3 more years of funding and we keep evolving this, is we've set up a 3-session intervention. So who knows the book Everybody? Oh, awesome book. So week 1, we read the book Everybody, and basically everybody, it's not disability, it's not autism. It reminds us that we're more similar than we think, that everyone has fear and joy and sadness, and everyone needs help, and everyone likes to feel useful, and so on. So we read the book. Then all the students made an Everybody monster of themselves. We gave templates, some used them, some made their own monster. We assembled them into an Everybody book for the class, and then they talked and found some peers in their classroom that had similar sort of Everybody traits to them. So that was session 1. Session 2, we read this book called Together We Roar that's written by Juliet, and Juliet is an autistic woman. She's a PhD student at
Portsmouth. She's under Dr. Stephen Kapp in the UK.
Okay. And so she wrote this book. Has anyone read this book? Okay.
Emily has.
So Mouse has autism. He's small. He's adventurous. He sometimes sees things in a different way, and that can make things hard for him. And Bear is large, and others don't always realize that he's compassionate as well. So together they explore the forest, they work together to overcome challenges. So it reinforces that although they're different, that they have many, many similarities.
And strengths that could become useful. So they get into a challenge and each one has to use their strengths to overcome the challenge. And so they have different strengths, and people are often scared of Bear because he's really big, and they think that he's going to be a bully or whatever, but he's like actually compassionate. So they figure out how they use their strengths to overcome the challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. And so read the book, and then again we had an activity for them. So they made strengths chains. And so when do I need help, and then how can I help others? These are just some examples of what the students wrote. Oh, these students were grade 2 and grade 4. So I need help when I'm feeling away from the world. I may need help interacting with others. What can I do? I can hug sad friends. I can include friends, and so on. And then we did a third session where we just wanted to reinforce that sort of strengths and similarities and uniques, but the positives of our unique attributes. And so we had a prompt question: what is special or unique about me? And then what interests do I have that might help me connect with others? And we did this tessellation tile activity where everyone drew one of these, and then we tried to link them together. And this is what was left in one of the classrooms. So that was that study, and we have so much qualitative data, and I don't think we have time for it all. But these are grade 2 and grade 4 students.
Do you want to see it here? There you go.
Oh, thank you. I don't have my reading glasses.
Do you want me to read it?
Oh, no, I can read it now. Okay. Thank you, though. And so we asked questions. So we did this with the students. We tried to do it with the autistic students. The students in these classes, unfortunately, weren't able to participate in interviews, and we didn't have alternatives, or they didn't want to. And with research, we didn't, we accepted that. But comments such as, so this is an educational assistant, is that before this, kids would treat him almost like baby talk. And then after the book, they just talked to him, and him is an autistic student in that class, and that there was a shift in the way they spoke to him. This student, their diagnosis was not disclosed to peers. It was not disclosed to that student. And so we never said who the student, the reason why this teacher asked us to come into their class. I will say it was obvious that this student needed an aid to support them to be successful in the classroom. But this was not student specific.
Yet it still changed them.
Well, so the EA's perception was that even though he wasn't identified, she saw a shift in how other peers interacted with this student in particular. When we asked some of the peers about how autism changed how you think or hang out with peers, so again, we didn't identify specific peers. And some kids, oh my goodness, their wisdom at this age was remarkable. So students said, I feel guilty saying this, but I tended to avoid, and they said a name, because I thought, oh, he's different, I don't want to be around him, but that was closed-minded thinking. And then the facilitator came in and talked to us about how autistic people have different ways of expressing themselves. And now I check my anger to be expressed differently than others. Just because he's more dramatic doesn't mean I can't hang out with him. So, there's some language in there I'm not sure about, but the peers were really reflecting. And then I think just to know that they really loved the activities. And these were like 45-minute sessions. Do you want me to do this one, Heather?
I think I take over now.
Okay.
I think that was the plan. But I can.
Yeah, so just an example. That's one example of some of the work we're doing. We're also doing some in university contexts. So we'll present on that next year.
Ha! So the fourth sort of practice or neuroaffirming practice, it has around to do with finding meaningful connections. So we have to really start with this idea that fitting in and belonging are two very different things. So fitting in means that changing who you are in order to be accepted, whereas belonging means being accepted just for who you are. And so because this idea of being accepted for just who I am, it can be really difficult when you're surrounded by people who act like the neuromajority, who are just able to act, very differently than I am, or have different sort of experiences than I do, in the sense that, like, for example, like just sitting in a room, right? Like sitting in a room listening to a lecture like this can be really hard if you're an autistic person, because you have to sit still, and you can't sit still because you're getting antsy, or you can't handle the movements or the sounds of the people around you, right? Like, so that type of thing is really hard for us. But it's really interesting what happens when you go into an all autistic space. Right? So to facilitate belonging and connection, we really need to focus on creating these inclusive neuroaffirming spaces in which members can be surrounded by like-minded individuals of neurodivergent friends and peers. Because members of such groups often feel great kinship for one another and provide opportunities for neurodivergent, meaningful friendships without needing us to mask or normalize our odd behaviors. And so such groups can also provide really valuable support and guidance. In such spaces, we can share our experiences and we can offer advice on how to navigate challenges, and they often really provide this sort of sense of community and belonging. And so actually in one of our studies that was actually done in post-secondary, this was one of the quotes from one of the individuals. So we had created what we call our Autistic Community Partner Board, and that was actually Emily was helping me do from the very beginning, was helping me build this board. And so we were interviewing these autistic community partners about their experience of being in the research, right? So we're not really talking about this neuroaffirming space, we're talking about what is it like for you to participate in this ACP board of autistic community partners and advise our research study and change our direction. And so this is what the person said. So she'd spent their life trying to fit in and figure out why I wasn't fitting in. And then all of a sudden, I haven't changed a single thing, but yet all of a sudden I'm fitting in and I belong and I feel valued. And it's mind-blowing. It's just mind-blowing that all of a sudden these things are not, you're not being in trouble for, or you're being understood, that it's not this huge problem anymore. It's just normal, and it's just okay, and it's just it is quite incredible. So go ahead. No. Oh, sorry, I thought you wanted to do the caveat. So the caveat is that we often think that these spaces are going to be really exclusionary, right? Like, so like that idea of like sending the kid to the special ed room, like that's showing them that they're broken. But sometimes those spaces, if it's like, I mean, obviously it's how you frame the room, but in that room, sometimes that is the place where we finally feel like we can relax. Like, so I'll give you a really good example. And when I was in high school, I was very badly bullied, like really badly bullied. But I was in Ontario at that time. We had something called enhanced classes, I think it was what it was called. And so basically, if you were gifted, you were able to take these sort of more intense classes, essentially, right? Well, I wasn't gifted. Obviously, my working memory sucks. There's no way that any kind of psychoed assessment is going to say that I'm gifted. Regardless, I was really into school. And I really liked school. And because I really liked school, everybody else hated me. Like, I mean, that was one of the things that I was picked on the most, right? Like, why does this loser want to try so hard in school? Okay, but eventually I just kept trying, and I kept trying, and I kept trying, and my grades go up, right? So, because this was the only thing I was good at, you can imagine I'm doing a lot of it, trying to get them higher and higher and higher. Well, in Ontario at that time, once your grades get high enough, they let you into those enhanced classes, right? And I remember the first day I walked in, and it was an incredible feeling, because I was safe. There was no one in that room who was going to bully me. There was no one in that room who was going to be mad at me because I liked school and I wanted to ask questions and I wanted to understand. It was the first time in my high school experience I had been safe, and that was an amazing feeling. So if we go to the next slide, basically this is actually my family in 2022, so that's actually my son. But there was this really cool study, right? So despite the harmful stereotypes that suggest we have no interest in developing social connections, we actually do want friends and romantic partners and social connections. And so Lamb and colleagues, and I think Dr. Lay was actually on that study, Lamb and colleagues, they reported that autistic young adults in their study were able to offer rich descriptions of their positive well-being, reflecting their unique individual differences, as well as a strong sense of connection to others in the community. And that's why the authors said that the overarching theme of their study is that autistic people are different, but they're connected. And so this is you just don't want to just assume that the way that that connection looks is going to look the same. So often what we do is we prioritize the development of only a few close friendships. My son literally said to me, he doesn't know anything about the research, clearly he doesn't like academia, but regardless, he literally said to me the other day, I have 3 friends, I don't want any more. 3 friends is my maximum. Right? It's not that he doesn't want friends, but he says most people annoy him. And so he only wants those 3 friends because if he has any more, he finds it overwhelming, right? And we see this in neurotypical students. So, sorry, just a second. So basically we often prioritize the development of a few close friendships over having this large social network. We also sometimes really appreciate animals and other things, like we'll develop really, really close attachments to animals. That's another way that our connection might look slightly different. Go ahead. I know I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to just finish this off. So the very last one is around this positive role models. There are so many autistic people who don't know what they can be. So for example, just the other day, we were preparing for a presentation we're going to do next week at a Western School Division. And so I was asking people for feedback on this neuroaffirming speaker series that I put together. And so somebody, and they sort of gave me a hard time because I've got Jessica McCabe from How to ADHD. She's coming to speak. I'm so excited. Regardless, she gave me a hard time for getting these superstar, neurodivergent people like these people here, right? She was giving me a hard time, like, why are you promoting this idea that, neurodivergence is only okay if you're some kind of superstar? And she's absolutely right. She's absolutely right that I shouldn't be necessarily putting that stereotype out there. That's not going to help us either. But you know what else won't help us? It won't help us if we don't know what's possible. And so, for example, when I gave that answer to the people in the Slack and I said, you're right, you're absolutely right. I'm not trying to say that you only have worth if you're successful in a capitalistic way. That's absolutely true. But this person said that this autistic student, so she's a teacher, an LSD teacher, she's been a teacher for 20 years, but she's also autistic. She said she had an autistic high school student who had been suicidal for over a year. And when she spoke to him, he said he had never seen, he believed that autism was a death sentence. He had never seen a single successful autistic person. He didn't think it was possible to thrive as an autistic person. And so for those people, having role models can really make it a difference in what we actually can achieve. And so it actually happened in my own life. So this guy's a Canadian, which is awesome. He's got super successful. He developed the Calm app. If you're familiar with it, if you're not, it's amazing. A great support for lots of neurodivergent people. And he's neurodivergent himself. So he's got ADHD, but he's also got, I think, ODD or something else as well. Maybe OCD. Anyway, I didn't know that meditation was possible with my ADHD. I honestly thought that my antsiness, my fidgetiness, my hyperness, I thought that precluded me from ever learning meditation, but it became one of my greatest strategies to help me regulate my nervous system, and that was possible because he said it was. Because here's a person with ADHD and other, sort of neurodivergent characteristics that are very similar to myself, and he's developed a whole meditation program for people just like me. And then I believed it was possible, and then I decided to try it, and it was an amazing strategy that really worked. And so these types of neurodivergent role models, understanding what might be possible, having neurodivergent professors standing in front of you so that my autistic students in the audience know that maybe someday they too can be a prof, that is a very strong way that we can signal to these kids what they might achieve someday. And so all we're going to say in conclusion, because we have a whole 1 minute and we're very proud of ourselves, is that valuing neurodiversity means that you understand that those who are wired differently from what is considered the norm are not bad, they're not disabled, and we don't need fixing. We are merely different. Thanks.
Rae Martens is a disabled self-advocate and a bereaved parent of an autistic young man who she has had the privilege of raising for 14 years. She functions as a knowledge broker, mentoring researchers and people with lived experience through the development of optimal community partnerships. She is affiliated with McMaster University, CanChild, and the University of Calgary, and Kids Brain Health Network. Welcome. I'd like to also introduce you guys to Dr. Mackenzie, an autism researcher and a postdoctoral fellow with the McMaster University Autism Research Team and Autism Alliance of Canada. He's also a Health Systems Impact Fellowship Program alumnus. He has a background in qualitative research and research engagement. He is currently working on several projects, all involving gathering information from and learning from the experiences of autistic adults and using the findings to inform policy change. Dr. Salt is currently the editor-in-chief of an all-autistic editorial board of the Canadian Journal of Autism Equity. Dr. Mackenzie, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Well, it's lovely to be here, everyone. First off, just to introduce myself, I also want to add a bit of an accommodation for myself as well, too. I have a diagnosis called vestibular migraine, which sometimes means I am challenged by the notion of aphasia, especially when I'm tired. And I flew in, I got here at about 12:30 this morning, so I'm a little on the zonk side. But if for some reason I decide to go nonverbal, I'll just go like this, and I'll try to get the rest of that information out to you when I'm feeling a little bit more verbal. Sometimes I can speak while singing. That's one of the weird things about aphasia, but I'm not going to subject you all to lecture karaoke today. I promise you that. Today, I just wanted to talk a bit about my own experiences from a number of different lenses. The first one being I got introduced to the notion of neurodevelopmental diagnoses in adolescence, actually, when I became a respite worker for Child and Family Services. I got to bring two boys who were brothers in the system out to a variety of different activities and things like that. I learned about social scripting in a variety of ways. I loved and special interests where he had the eldest had a love for memorizing Disney movies, and the song Zoot Suit Boogie or Zoot Suit Riot. That's the one it was. My apologies. Anyways, that so the notion of having fun for me was always just a key part of being a respite worker. But I also found myself in a space where I actually ended up having a conversation with the kid's biological dad, and unfortunately in a very undignified way where he was quite intoxicated, but he ended up telling me exactly what it meant to do right by his kids and get them back. I won't go into the details of that because the rest of the story deserves its own personal sense of dignity, but at the same time, I wanted to bring back to that theme of just doing right by your kids and how that notion gets translated from a variety of different lenses, not just my own here today. So I wanted to take an opportunity to introduce you to the notion of a touch more on the complex side. This is my son, Luke. Luke was born at a whopping 3 pounds, 7 ounces and was 16 inches long. And one of my aunt-in-laws said he was the cutest little alien you've ever seen. He just had these big, cute little eyes, hypertelorism, and just skinny, like built like a butter knife, essentially. Just an adorable little kid, though. He ended up being diagnosed with something called mosaic trisomy 22. And if you're familiar with the term in genetics, trisomy means you have an extra copy of a specific chromosome. So for example, Down syndrome is the 21st, and that is a form of trisomy. The 22nd is the one that is attributed to growth. So the picture of him in the slide, he was 13 years old at the time. And that hat was meant for a 4-year-old. Which was an interesting experience when you're going through puberty and you have a kid that size with a little mustache growing. Like, I don't even know how to wrap my brain around it. And still yet you're so adorable at the time. He pictured himself to be quite the comedian, made sure that everybody thought he was hilarious. I even got to share his love of the movie Moana, just one song, because this one song was the song of the angels. And if you weren't engaging to the same degree with him with the love of that song, he would pinch you until you decided, yes, it is the perfect song. but I also wanted to just share some of the experiences as well too that medical complexity comes with when it comes to building a life when you're not entirely sure how long that life is going to be as a family. Especially, this is why the session today is called "We Did Good," because it was about 10 days ago, my family and I, we marked the 4th anniversary of his passing, and definitely the worst day of my life, but at the same time as well too, my spouse in one of the darkest moments looked at me and said, "We did good." And in my head, there was something that froze, like that academic brain, really, dang, I got to write that down for a future lecture. I don't know what happened, but it was just one of those things. But I really got me thinking about the fact that I just want that for every family. I want that opportunity for people to feel with every bit of confidence that they did good. And that's going to be marked by thousands of unique stories in the end. But at the same time, it's that person that you're with in the moment where that goal just truly authentically matters. And when it came to the notion of understanding what healthcare kind of looked like in the world of complexity, I think I really got my first low bar set in terms of patient and family-centered care. He got discharged, he was born end of August. He discharged in September. And from then on, we were doing genetic testing at the time. This was before microarray, so they were growing cells under a microscope and doing things for lengthy periods of time. Christmas Eve day, I get a phone call from the genetics office saying they found something and it's quite serious and we can't tell you what it is over the phone due to health regulations. We'll see you in February. Merry Christmas. And I can't tell you how much that is to just knock the wind out of the first Christmas with your child, to know that something's wrong and whether or not this is going to be the last Christmas. And so I think at that point, I really realized how important it was to know what my family deserved, what my son deserved in care, all of these things all together. And that's kind of what influenced me in a bigger, larger world to understand what partnership was. I, about, 10 years actually this year, got connected with a program called Parents Partnering in Research. It was a study done by CanChild and Kids Brain Health Network. You can actually join the group on Facebook as well too. I'd be happy to have all of you there. Parents Partnering in Research was an opportunity to consider what engagement of community members looked like on social media. So it wasn't exactly like this idea that I had to go to university. I had to take time off, not only just get childcare, but get specialized childcare, train that person in the day, because you're not necessarily sure you're going to get somebody who knows exactly what it means to do first aid. All of these things come with labor to be engaged and to help further research. And so the idea of doing that in social media was very attractive. And I joked a lot because I realized that people were going to be very uncomfortable with the idea of convenient engagement. And so I kind of pushed the mark a little bit and called it engaging in your underwear, just because I could sit and give my son a breathing treatment and then talk about research or about disability and things like that. It was accessible and it was on my terms and not somebody else's terms. And how that has moved through the years has actually given me a real deep interest in the subject of disability rights. And as you can see, this is me and a few other people who you may have had contact with, Keiko Thomas, who will be here as well, and Jonathan Lyth from the National Autism Alliance. And then also in the other photo is the head, one of the CEOs of Inclusion Canada, and Steve Esty, who is an advocate who unfortunately passed away recently, but he is quite literally the reason there is a broken red chair in front of the United Nations in Geneva. I found that there were such significant knowledge gaps. I didn't even know exactly what rights I had access to that I could connect with. I realized that I wasn't the only one as well too. And so for me, I had this opportunity to not only contribute lived experience in this space, but also take that information and broker that out to the world in places, the community members that I connected with in the long run as well too. And that became something quite significant because people, when lack of information persists in the world, you only view it from a very limited sense. And when you open that for other people, you see a bigger, broader world, and you see one where you bring more power to people who may have limited power, who never even realized they had those connections in the first place. So the more that we can build those exchanges really got me understanding the fact that we still have this system where we do collaborative work that kind of still thinks about it in singular instances, where it's just like the amount of time within a study, boop, 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 exchange of information done. In reality, what we're seeing more often is people are coming back to studies and doing this work in the long run. I have been partnering for 10 years. What does that mean for a person? Why does somebody do that for that long? You're going to find a lot of people who find that as well too. And what we have seen in some studies through organizations like CanChild is that people find meaning in this work as a part of their overall understanding of who they are, their sense of self. And so what that means is that there is this notion, and I'll be talking a bit about this on Wednesday as well too, that this work contributes to not only just the notion of systemic change, but there's a component about well-being that we don't necessarily know enough about yet. And obviously, there's a lot to be understood about the notion of nothing about us without us. And this is a phrase that I also want to really encourage you to think about, the fact that I've seen studies use this on occasion, but I don't think you want to use that loosely. You don't want to use that in a way that just means like, hey, I'm part of the club, like me as a Gen Xer trying to get, hang out with my Gen Z family members and things like that. Hey, how are sports? Like, you don't want that sort of connection. You want to think about the fact that this is something that is born out of protest in many respects. So please, if you're going to use phrases like this, please give it the weight that it deserves. Now, there is a lot to be said about representation as well too as a parent. I mean, obviously my own disability came more as an adult onset thing, but I also grew up as a parent through the era of the autism epidemic and all of the things that come with that as well too. Not a phrase I'm a big fan of, but there is still a bit of a conversation to be had, and very rightfully so, about this idea of parents being their child's voice. Now, I think there's a deeper nuance to that because my son was non-speaking. I was gifted with the last 6 months of his life where suddenly he figured out how to use his AAC. And but the thing is, I always knew exactly what he wanted to say, but his thoughts, his interests, his experiences were his alone. So at the same time, while we I grew up with this phrase of I am my child's voice, I want to think about it a little differently, and to really encourage families to think about this way in the gentlest way possible, is that it's not exactly like we're their voice, we're their microphone. We're amplifying who they are for them, like any other child, to be their best selves. And that is a conversation that can sometimes come across aggressively, and I get where that comes from. I have been in enough disability rights spaces to know where frustration comes from, where trauma comes from, all of these things. And at the same time, when we can operate as people who connect with people in inclusive research in a way that is gentle and teaching, people begin to see exactly how to connect to that new information and take it on as their own, because trust becomes so much a big part of knowledge acquisition that we need to give people that space to take that to heart. People don't just automatically take something and go, it's not always enough to just say something and be like, yep, that's mine, I've adopted that now. Sometimes it takes more for someone to see that and tattoo that on their heart. So in the world of connecting with people where there's just a lot of maybes in the world, I just want to kind of talk a bit about the fact that within the last 6 months, I mentioned as well that my son picked up his AAC, and at the first time he kind of looked at me and he says, I want to pick a movie, Mom. He was saying, in a non-speaking way, I'm about to search for something on YouTube, and he says, nope, I've got this. And he types out Barney Christmas movie. And I'm like, where did that come from, buddy? And that was probably the nicest thing in the world. We had so many moments that will always stick with me, where he got me to come close to him once, and he says, joke. You want to play a joke? Okay. Who are you playing a joke with? Dad. Okay. So what he wanted to do was to have me help him walk him over to my spouse to smack his dad in the butt and then run away laughing. That was his thought about being funny. He loved nurses. He loved women in a way that had that nurturing spirit that just didn't really judge him for a lot. The first time he met his gastroenterologist, he had saw her and basically in the middle of a fit looked up and said, would you massage my feet? And for him, the notion of someone massaging his feet was love. And so when there's a lot to be said about people who are in communities upon which there is sometimes a questionable future ahead in terms of what that looks like. I think I just wanted to drive home that you can be involved with people's lives even when there is tragedy or trauma associated with it. You just need to be led by them in terms of what they need in the moment. I would also say that there is a lot to be said about talking about grief in this area as well, given that palliative care, I went about 7.5 years without palliative care. And I really didn't know what I was missing until I got it. And the fact that I needed someone to help me be a decider. And that was anybody. It wasn't just physicians. It was OTs, PTs, things like that. Despite the fact that he palliated for about 7.5 years, I needed somebody to help me just kind of put things in a bigger picture. And we sometimes just need people to come alongside and go, okay, so how can I help you paint that picture in a way that makes sense for you? These things are not barriers. This is not, these aren't lines that are dubious in terms of, creating a level of professionalism where we keep away from people. That's just being kind. There's a really great book, and I would recommend this to anybody, called Why We Revolt, by Victor Montori. He used to teach at McMaster, but he talks about the notion of systems that can sometimes feel a little bit on the cold side, and how that flips in contrast with the notion of being kindness. And I actually quoted him once writing an article for CBC, and because he says in his book that the best bits of care are a dance where everybody knows the steps. And in some cases, when it comes to doing this type of work, I haven't always known the steps. And in some cases, it kind of felt like I was being dragged across the dance floor, or proverbial dance floor, by my hair. So we need to think about how we can innovate in ways where we all know the steps together, and to just kind of step a little bit out of the comfort zone of the textbook and think about where humanity fits into the equation here as well too. But as kids grow and develop as well too, I also wanted to just offer the fact that it's important to tell your kids why they partner, why you partner with researchers or and move things forward. Because it's one thing to go to a doctor's appointment where you have to check in and do something, but to do something on your own time, there needs to some degree be some reason and purpose behind that, and help people better understand what it means to improve the story for other people, or for themselves for that matter. But also there is a real lack of understanding of how how parents can transition their kids to thinking independently as to whether or not they wish to do this on their own when they have the capability to self-advocate. this is a real gap that I have yet to really find any information on, but I do want to point that out and see how we can start having that conversation as a collective as well. Because your kids deserve a choice at the end of the day as well too. And it is a lot for me to hand off my child to you for one reason or another, because I have that established sense of trust with you. And I know that what is happening, and this is actually something that I'm what they call a Facebook power admin, which is really weird. I'm not the biggest social media fan, but what that means essentially is that I connect with a larger group of network for people who have really large Facebook groups, hence the Parents Partnering and Research thing. And this is something that I connected with a lot of people who have health groups on social media, and they have said that if I'm going to make a choice to hitch my star to you, I want to know that what you're doing matters. And that's going to be the same for kids that you connect with as well too, as they move forward and they understand the notion of independently partnering with you and what that means for them specifically. So I just want you to take an opportunity to imagine while you're here what that system looks like, as we consider about how we can create more patient and family community centered research work, healthcare, things like that, in terms of what really matters with the people that you connect with. And I would be interested in hearing your conversations here this week. Come stop me in the hall. I'm happy to have a conversation about it.
Well, how can I follow that? Well, let's talk. So we've heard about how to interact with autistic people. We've heard about the parent and child perspectives. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the adult experiences. So this presentation is actually going to talk about the results of a national survey that I did, the Canadian Autistic Adult Needs Assessment Survey. Once again, I'm Mackenzie Salt. I'm on the steering committee for CanNRT, as well as a postdoctoral fellow with McMaster University and Autism Alliance of Canada. I'd like to acknowledge the funders of the project, so Public Health Agency of Canada, Canadian Institute for Health Research, and the Israeli Foundation, as well as you have the logos of my affiliations. And I would like to thank not just the funders, but the partner organizations, and most importantly, the lived experience partners and the respondents to this survey, because without them, we would not have the understanding that we have now of what they go through in their daily lives. So, how did this project come about? It came about because we don't know much about autistic adults in Canada. We don't know what their daily life is like. We don't know what their quality of life is like. We don't know what their needs are. And why don't we know this? Because our support systems end after childhood. And that can depend on the province. So in some provinces that's 18, others it's 21, others it's 24. But we don't know anything about them because the traditional domains where we get a chance to support people and things are the school system. And once they're out of the school system, what do we know about them? So there aren't many services for autistic adults in Canada. And the few that there are, they're not publicly funded. They tend to be private. There are very few publicly funded autism adult services. In fact, those that are there are usually sort of pan-disability or general disability supports. So, and when we look at previous outreach to autistic adults in Canada, it's been very limited. And even the Canadian Academy for Health Sciences put out a report not that long ago indicating that our knowledge of autistic adults is a huge gap in terms of research, in terms of policy, and most of the input that we generally gather is from caregivers about autistic children or from professionals, experts who may not have lived experience. So in the spirit of nothing about us without us, I co-designed the Canadian Autistic Adult Needs Assessment Survey. So this was a hybrid survey with both quantitative and qualitative questions. It was 97 questions covering 11 areas of life, including finances, employment, physical and mental health. We had sensory issues, personal relationships and social relationships, and more. It was co-designed with lived experience partners. And one of the reasons why I did that was my experience as an autistic adult is just representative of my experience. You've probably heard the expression, when you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. It's very true. So, and when I was doing my doctoral work, I found a lot of my assumptions based on my own experience to be challenged. And I realized, you know what? I need to learn some of this. I need to engage with more people. So we had 9 autistic adults and 1 autism parent who was also a researcher, and covering a variety of ages, genders, and abilities. I developed the initial survey draft, reviewing the research on quality of life, looking at questionnaires that have been used with autistic adults, autistic children, disabled adults, older adults. And the survey ended up going through 4 iterations before it was finalized. And one of the things that was important about this survey was we targeted autistic adults aged 30 years and older. Because while there isn't much work on autistic adults, much of the work that is done in that 18 to 29-year-old demographic for various reasons. And so we don't know anything about the autistic adults age 30 plus, except for there are some isolated case studies looking at individual people, but we really don't know much beyond that. So when we went through these iterations, we ended up going through 4 iterations before we had a survey that everyone could agree to. And many of the questions from the existing questionnaires, about approximately 2/3, were reworded because lived experience partners found them too vague. For example, one question was, how would you rate your overall health? This perplexed a lot of people. And because we had feedback that, well, my physical health is good, but my mental health sucks. So do I put a 5? What do I do with that? How do I quantify that? So we end up splitting that question into one about how would you rate your physical health? How would you rate your mental health? And that was much more positively reviewed. The survey was actually made longer and more comprehensive, despite concerns from some of the partner organizations, because the lived experience partners they understood that the needs had been unknown for so long that they didn't want subsequent surveys and possibly missing things. So what do we cut out of this survey? Do we cut out employment? Do we cut out finances? Those are still big needs. So why don't we do a more comprehensive survey that we only do it once, rather than having to do subsequent surveys again and again and again, and sort of irritating the community more and trying to get that same level of engagement each time, which can be problematic. And in fact, there was one section that I hadn't originally noted from any other quality of life questionnaire that was on transportation. And that was added because because the lived experience partners brought it up. It was not something that I'd seen in any other quality of life questionnaires. But I ended up finding a questionnaire about transportation with their feedback, and we adapted some of those questions too. So in terms of the survey itself, it was open for 2 months. It was advertised through social media and 15 dissemination partner organizations. So some of these organizations helped amplify the online presence. Some, especially those that had a physical presence, they took paper copies of the survey and would hand them out to people, and especially for people who were uncomfortable with technology or in areas where internet connectivity was not great. because the survey was primarily online. So we did have a paper option, and we did have a phone option where people could phone in or use Zoom and then go through it with a research team member. And so the median survey completion time was about 45 minutes. And in the end, after scraping the data for bots, which is a whole other presentation, that's already up on YouTube, by the way. Google my name, you'll find it. We ended up with 1,912 responses. This is the largest sampling, to my knowledge, of autistic adults in Canada. And now, this survey was open to people with an autism diagnosis, as well as those who identified as autistic but did not have a diagnosis. Now, this is something that was a little controversial and still is, depending on who you talk to. And the perspective on this was, Canada does not have a publicly funded adult diagnostic program. There are certain provinces that do it, but there are incredibly long wait lists. So we actually did follow-up to this project, and one of the participants told us they waited 4 years on a wait list for a publicly funded diagnosis. You could get a privately funded one, but that costs $5,000. But if it's not if there's no adult services, why would you pay $5,000 to get a diagnosis that doesn't lead to anything? So when you look at just the autistic adults who have a diagnosis, you have a very limited profile. So we ended up opening it up to anyone who identified as autistic but did not yet have a diagnosis. And then respondents had the choice to be compensated for completing the survey. It was up to them. And the reason we gave them the choice is that if they had disability benefits from their province, depending on the rules, they could be negatively impacted financially by accepting compensation. So in terms of our sample, we had representation from every province and territory. And then in terms of ethnicity, the sample was 78% identified as white, 6% identified as Indigenous. In terms of gender, well, we had sex at birth was almost 3/4 were female, and almost 1/4 was male. Just over 1/4 was male. And then in terms of gender, cisgender men made up almost 23%, cisgender women made up almost 53%, and gender diverse people, so that included non-binary, transgender, two-spirit, and other categories, made up almost 22%. Now, it's good to know because autistic people have higher rates of gender diversity than the non-autistic population. So in terms of our sample, about 55% of respondents had a diagnosis and 45% did not. In terms of age, about 74% were between the ages of 30 and 44. So the CAHS report, the few adults they were able to talk to, none of them were over 45. So just over 1/4 of our sample was 45 or older, and the oldest respondent was 78 years old. 65.5% had completed a college diploma or university degree, so our sample was very highly educated. And 68.8% indicated that they had support needs, with almost 42% indicated they had low support needs, almost 25% had moderate support needs, and only 2.3% had high support needs. So there were some gaps in who we were able to get, including people with higher levels of support needs. So the issues that we see here, the needs that we see here, are likely underestimated because of our sample. So almost 66% of respondents who had a diagnosis were diagnosed as adults. And we can see here from the table, you can see that we had 4 participants who were diagnosed as autistic after the age of 65. So, and many being diagnosed between the ages of 25 and 45. And we asked about the impacts of diagnosis and on various areas of life. And 67.5% of respondents felt that getting a diagnosis of autism had a positive or very positive impact on understanding themselves and their personal identity. Over half said it had a positive effect on their mental health, and just under half said it had positive impact on their personal relationships. And the types of professionals who were providing the diagnosis, so in this question, people could select any types of professionals that were involved. So in a team setting, they could select more than one. But the types of professionals providing the diagnosis, almost 54% were psychologists, 31% were psychiatrists, but only just under 14% were family doctors. And this is important because family doctors are the first step in getting to a diagnosis, getting to care, because then you'll need a referral to see a specialist. And so if we can get more family doctors comfortable and involved, then that can help things down the line. Self-identity. So 79% of respondents who didn't have a diagnosis would seek one if there were no barriers. This is huge. So these are not people who are just saying they're autistic to fit in or something like that. They want to be assessed, but they can't afford it. It's too far away. There's no one around who can do it. There's lots of reasons why. So cost, lack of people being nearby, and lengthy wait lists were the three most frequent barriers, with cost being a barrier for 2/3 of people. And then many people identified as being autistic because they had, over half had an autistic relative or friend, and they saw similarities between them and themselves. 3/4 had done a quiz or questionnaire that said they could be autistic. And I love the bottom one. Over 1/4 were told by a medical professional that they could be autistic. So that could be, for example, the child has been assessed as autistic, and the person says, you know what, you have some of those traits too. Maybe you could be autistic. But then they're not able to go for an assessment because they're either not specialized with adults or they don't have the money. And there's other issues there. So there's some pretty significant barriers that we're seeing already. So finances. Now, keep in mind the age group. This is 30 plus. 56% of respondents did not have any retirement savings. So, and 1/4 of the people in this are 45 plus, sort of getting to that point of like over almost 10% were over 55 and close to retirement. So 42.7% did not have short-term savings. 25.4% did not have enough money for the things they need. And just over 68% spend more than 30% of their monthly income on housing, or their housing costs are paid by somebody else. This is compared to 21% of homeowners and 33% of renters in the general population. So we see significant issues with affordability of housing in this population. In terms of employment, over 1/3 were not working at the time of the survey. The top things that they said they needed to work: flexible work hours, remote work, accommodations in the physical work environment. 60% of the respondents who were not working said they did not have sufficient supports to find a job. And we've done focus groups since, and they've said that, well, it's very common to have help with getting a resume together, but what about training for doing an interview or negotiating a salary or some of these other things that are part of that job finding process? And then of the working respondents, just under 50% did not have sufficient supports to help them do the job they had. And almost 55% of working respondents did not have sufficient supports to advance in their job. So they were stuck where they were, and were having and some were struggling at where they were. And really importantly, less than 30% of working respondents used accommodations at work. So is it that the accommodations weren't available? Is it that they didn't know they could ask? Is it inaccessibility in the workplace? We don't know the specific reasons, but the fact that there are various provinces have legislation around accessibility in the workplace and about accommodations, but they're not being used.
or not being accessed. In terms of physical health, 46.6% of respondents rated their physical health as fair or poor, with over 50% lacking sufficient access to a regular healthcare provider to fully meet their needs, with over 2/3 lacking access to specialist healthcare providers to fully meet their needs. More than 50% lack sufficient access to healthy food to fully meet their needs. Now, as some people spoke about the issues because of their diets, because they may have other types of health conditions that negatively affect their diets. For example, they might have celiac and need gluten-free foods, which cost more, that they may not be able to afford. And then we have just over 71% lack sufficient sleep or rest to meet their needs. And we know that sleep issues are a significant issue for autistic people. Over 2/3 of respondents said they routinely feel pain or discomfort. And of those who routinely feel pain, almost 2/3 reported their pain as moderate or worse. So that's 4 out of 10 or higher. 57% of respondents who routinely feel pain indicate that their pain interferes with their daily life moderately or more. And we take a look at, you have a lot of people in pain, but also who are lacking providers, who are lacking places for help and support. In terms of mental health, 60% of respondents rated their mental health as fair or poor. 74.7% lack sufficient access to mental health services to completely meet their needs. 71.7% lack sufficient access to counseling or coaching to completely meet their needs. 51% of respondents indicated that emotional issues interfered with their daily life quite a bit or more. 87.5% of respondents feel left out or isolated at least some of the time. 78.4% of respondents feel they lack companionship at least some of the time. And we know that loneliness negatively affects mental health. Only 32.1% of respondents are mostly or completely able to do the things they like due to their state of health. That includes physical and mental health. In terms of health management, almost 85% of respondents indicated that they have recurring or chronic health conditions, with 81.2% of those who have recurring chronic health conditions having anxiety issues, almost 2/3 having depression, over 50% having attention issues, just over 50% having GI or digestive issues, almost 50% having sleep issues, 44% having trauma-related issues, and then 42% having bone, joint, or muscle-related problems. 41.1% of those respondents who have chronic conditions indicated that they have more than 5 types of chronic conditions. And a total of 32 condition types were identified in the survey. We had our initial list, and then when we coded the other please specify, we ended up having to create more categories. 26.5% of respondents regularly used 5 or more different medications over the last month to manage their health. So we're seeing a lot of complex needs. So in terms of next steps for this work, there's a follow-up project to learn about mental health services, community-based social support services of autistic adults based on this survey. So in this survey, we asked the respondents, what are the most important areas for us to do research? And they said mental health, and they said social supports and relationships. So we ended up doing a qualitative follow-up in terms of 12 focus groups of 64 people total, and we're just writing that up now. And when you look at what we've done here, there's a lot more research that's needed to capture the needs and experiences of other autistic people that we were unable to reach in large numbers. So we previously mentioned this, getting more older autistics, higher support needs, lower levels of education, as well as members of ethnic or visible minorities. In conclusion, autistic adults in Canada have complex needs, and that are generally not being met. And it's really important to know that one size does not fit all. the individual profiles based on what we gathered are incredible. It's hard to find one type of support that would really help everybody. So different people have different needs. They're at different stages of their life. They're living in different parts of the country where services vary because of our provincial territorial system. So, but my hope and the goal was for the data from this survey to provide a starting point for future work and fill significant gaps in our knowledge. So, thank you very much.